So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Veerle Dossche. I'm the EU Hydrogen Policy Project Manager at Agora Industry. And so warm welcome to all of you to our webinar Global Green Fertilizer Tracker. And so before starting off, let me quickly introduce you to the program of today. So after my introduction, my colleague Caro will introduce you to our Global Green Fertilizer Tracker. She will give a short presentation about this tracker. And then after this, we will have a panel discussion. And then we have also foreseen time for questions from the audience. So, but before Caro will start with her presentation, we still wanted to ask you a question with regards to fertilizer projects. The question is, how many renewable nitrogen fertilizer projects are currently in operation worldwide? What is your idea about it? And so we will show you the responses to the question later in the webinar. So, but we've put this question also into the Mentimeter. So you can go to menti.com and type in the code 35140309. You can also find it in the chat. You can find a link in the chat. And so after later in this webinar, we will show you the to see a bit like how, what is your idea? What are your thoughts about it? And then see after the presentation of Caro, we will have a look at the responses. So let us now go to the presentation about the Global Green Fertilizer Tracker. This will be presented by my colleague, Caroline Paul. She's the Project Officer Hydrogen at Agora Industry, and she has been facilitating this work of Agora on the renewable fertilizers in the past few months. So, Caro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Veerle. And I will share my screen with you. There, it should be visible. And I also warm welcome to you from my side. I have the pleasure to present to you today the results of our efforts of the past couple weeks and months in the Global Green Fertilizer Tracker. And disclaimer, we are talking about the greening of nitrogen fertilizer production here. Before we go a bit deeper in the content, let me briefly introduce to you Agora Industry in case you are not familiar with us yet. We are a think tank, part of a bigger think tank family, and we develop scientifically sound and evidence-based solutions and strategies in order to reach a climate neutral industry internationally. So our only commitment is to climate action. And we have offices in various parts of the world, 4 locations, and cooperate also with a big network of partner think tanks on the ground. So getting back to the topic of today, transformation of nitrogen fertilizer production. Why is that an issue? And why do we need to transform at all? And the reason for this being, of course, is emissions related. More than 1 gigaton of global greenhouse gas emissions are related to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers in total. And this bar shows you where they originate. And part of the emissions come from production. Another part comes from transport. Urea is a special case. This is in line with CO2 released after the application of urea on the field. So urea does contain a carbon molecule. We'll talk about this later. But you also see that the biggest share of this bar is soil-related emissions. So basically having to do with microbial activity, which happen after fertilizer application. And we recognize that this is the biggest part of the emissions. However, I want to stress that in this webinar and in this work stream, we will focus on the production part of the bar today. So how can we get rid of those 440 megatons CO2 equivalents? What can we do basically? right? And here enters renewable hydrogen as a potential game changer. Hydrogen is the molecule needed in order to produce ammonia, and ammonia is the building block for modern nitrogen fertilizers. This bar here shows you the the current uses of hydrogen in 2022, and you see that industry is the biggest sector which needs hydrogen molecules. After refining, but going a bit deeper into the graph, you also see that in total 22% of the global hydrogen is currently used for ammonia production, specifically for nitrogen fertilizers. So this is quite substantial. And the problem associated with that, of course, is that this hydrogen is predominantly produced from unabated fossil sources, mainly gas and coal. This is where the emissions, those 440 megatons per annum, come from, and which we want to tackle ideally as soon as possible. So, how can we do that? By means of renewable fertilizers. But what are they exactly and how are they produced? Now, I'd like to take you down a little bit of technology, down the technology road here. And in this diagram, first of all, you see the conventional pathway as it's been deployed for the past 80 years or so globally. So we need, in order to produce conventional nitrogen fertilizers, we need a source of energy, which comes from unabated fossil gas and coal. We need hydrogen and nitrogen molecules, which are derived from SMR and ATR processes, so steam methane, autothermal reforming. And these together, these two molecules are synthesized into ammonia by the very well-known process of Haber-Bosch, very well established, operated for a long time. And in the special case of urea, which is the nitrogen fertilizer containing a carbon molecule, we also need this carbon molecule, which in this conventional process comes from SMR and ATR already. This will yield a conventional nitrogen fertilizer. Now, improving emissions, we can, of course, go to a low carbon fertilizer by capturing the carbon along the process. But still, this will, of course, yield emissions. Now, the first renewable fertilizer I would present is via the biomethane route. So essentially, the only thing that changes here is the feedstock, which now comes from biological sources and not from fossil methane. But we'll talk about sustainability's concern associated with that in a second. Now, jumping to number 5, I did not miscount, but this is the first or our favorite renewable fertilizer, so to say, which comes from renewable electricity together with water undergoing an electrolytic process will yield renewable hydrogen. So this hydrogen is not fossil-based, it's completely renewable. In this case, we need an air separation unit to supply the nitrogen. And in case of producing urea, we also need to add another source, an alternative source for the carbon molecule, which ideally comes from biogenic or sources or from direct air capture. And this yields a renewable fertilizer. Now, a mixture of those two worlds can be seen in pathway number 4, which is essentially using the conventional route, but also feeding in a quota of 10 to 20% renewable hydrogen, so resulting in a fertilizer which has less emissions than the conventional product. And pathways number 3, 4, and 5, we have actually also recorded in our tracker. So these are the ones that we really found also in our research, just to keep that in mind. And of course, renewable ammonia from elsewhere, which has been using nitrogen fertilizers from this renewable ammonia. So I briefly mentioned before sustainability. right? Also, renewable fertilizers need to comply with some significant sustainability criteria. First of all, renewable hydrogen production requires a lot of renewable energy, and we need to make sure that the renewable energy resources are additional. Hydrogen production also requires water, and this likewise should be sourced sustainably and not exacerbate local water stress. In case of the biomethane route and the carbon required for urea production, similar to water, we can say that this also should be sourced sustainably. So basically, it should not stand in competition with food production or nature conservation, and the sustainable, the availability of those biogenic resources for fertilizer production is very much dependent on the local context. It's very hard to give an overarching recommendation for this, but really depends on local conditions and capacities. So you might wonder now, what is this tracker? What have we actually produced? And the tracker is an interactive map which looks like this. And you may even say, wow, this is really underwhelming. It's only 8 points on a map for now. And that's true. That's what the situation looks like right now. And what we have tracked is projects producing renewable nitrogen fertilizer, which are already operational. So 4 of those dots in green are the operational projects. Another 4 projects are coming online very soon. So really in the next couple of months or until the end of the year. And this is really what the picture looks right now. Still, I want to say, I think it's really important to kickstart this discussion right now, because in the end, we want to get to a situation with more dots on the map. And this is really the start of a bigger monitoring of renewable fertilizer production. And we hope and anticipate that this project landscape is moving forward and changing rapidly. So a bit needless to say, we will update this tool very regularly. So I would hope that you see an increase of projects in the next couple of months and years, of course. I'll show you in a second what exactly we've recorded, but before, just to mention the sources for this tracker. We used company websites for this, so mainly press releases, ESG, and financial reporting in order to derive the data. I'll present to you in a second. All of the data can be found in the little sources table that you can click on the lower left-hand side. But also, this, as I mentioned, it's just the start of the monitoring. If you come from the fertilizer industry and sit in the audience and you are producing renewable fertilizers already right now and do not show up in this map, please get in touch with us. We're happy to include you on any further updates of the map. So one example of what precisely we have recorded here, I'll show you 2 cases now. The first one is located in Norway, operated by Yara, the Porsgrunn ammonia plant. It's been online since last year. Renewable ammonia for 100% renewable fertilizers is produced here by means of an electrolyzer, and the output is quite large for these projects. It's 20,000 tons of ammonia per year, and Yara has offtake agreements with agricultural corporations in Argentina, Germany, and Sweden. Now, keep in mind this output capacity of 20,000 tons ammonia per year. Quite different is the next project operated in Kenya by Thales, a US-based company, much smaller, rather in startup, well, beyond startup stages, I would say, but a much smaller size in total. What they did was simply put a container directly on the site in Kenya onto the farm. A dedicated renewable energy PV was deployed specifically for this renewable ammonia production. So really a solar PV farm is standing right next to this container, and the output is 1 ton of ammonia per day. So really a big difference compared to the last project. And they also have an offtake agreement with Kenya Nut Company, 15-year offtake agreement. So summing up some of the key results, we can see right now, as I mentioned before, drop in the ocean, less than 0.3% of the global ammonia production for nitrogen fertilizer at the moment is renewable. So it's very small capacity. Most projects are in pilot stages, but have high ambition of scaling up in the near future. So there'll be something moving soon. The renewable energy sources for these projects are mainly solar PV, but also grid electricity, and one project operates via biomethane. So I mentioned before, we want to kickstart and support this discussion towards renewable fertilizers, but how can we move forward this discussion really? What can we do? One angle of approaching it is via the demand side, and we see that the production of renewable fertilizer will also depend on binding offtake agreements. So in this bar, we see that major, really global players, major food and beverage producers are committed to reducing their emissions, including Scope 3 emissions, which also includes the emissions from supply chains up and downstream, so including fertilizers. But apart from the interest of those global players who are willing and able to pay a green premium, the question is who would come up for this green premium after all? And maybe we can also discuss a bit further in the panel discussion on this topic. So, closing the transformation gap, how is that going to be possible? This last bar shows you the situation right now. So the actual production of low emissions hydrogen for fertilizers as we've calculated in our tracker in 2024. And you see the huge way to go until reaching IEA's net zero scenario for 2030. So it's really quite a gap between those 0.1 megatons green hydrogen and the 6 megatons of hydrogen as it is projected by IEA, what would be needed. We have instruments in place in some parts of the world, for example, carbon pricing, but we also see that it's not sufficient to incentivize renewable fertilizers over conventional ones. So we conclude that, of course, we need dedicated policies in order to stimulate both the ramp up of renewable fertilizer supply, but also take care of the offtake side from agricultural producers. And as mentioned before, the overall greenhouse gas impact will also really depend on the deployment of additional energy sources, which are renewable energy sources needed for renewable hydrogen production. And with this, I'd like to thank you very much. The tool will come online after the webinar on our homepage. So please bear with us for just a second, a bit longer. And again, the call, if you have a renewable nitrogen fertilizer project, which is already operational and does not show up in the map, or you want to change something, then get in touch with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm handing back to Veerle.
Thank you, Caro, for your presentation. And for the audience, you might have noticed that there was a slight a disturbance in the presentation of Caro, but that was only for half a minute. So our apologies for that, but I think the big part of our presentation went well, and you were all able to follow, hopefully, the big chunk of her presentation. We promised you that earlier that after her presentation, we would show you the responses on the question we asked you before, namely, how many renewable nitrogen fertilizer projects will be operational by the end of 2024. So let's see what the responses were. So yeah, I would say not too bad. So the majority of the people said it would be less than 14. We noticed from Caro that currently there are 8 in operation. So people who responded had a quite good feeling or guess of how many projects are currently operational. So well done to the audience who participated. Thank you very much, Grace, for showing that. So let's go then to the next session of our webinar. We have a nice panel for you with interesting speakers. And before I introduce you to them to you, sorry, let me repeat that after the panel discussion, there's also the opportunity for the audience to ask questions. So if you have questions, put it in the Q&A Zoom function, and then after the panel discussion, we can take them up. They can be about the presentation you just saw, or they can also be addressed to one of our speakers. So the panel of today, first of all, I would like to welcome Theresa von Saldern. Welcome, Theresa. Theresa works at the German Federal Foreign Office as desk officer for global food security. She currently engages in the non-fossil fertilizer initiative, and this initiative focuses on the African continent. And then as a second panelist, I would like to introduce you to Marc is Director of Green Developments, responsible for the transition to net zero in 2035 of Fertiberia. With a vast experience in the fertilizer and ammonia space, he's leading the commercialization of green fertilizers for the company, where Fertiberia is a pioneer based on their running green ammonia production in Puertolano in Spain. My Spanish is not so good, so welcome also, Marc. Marc and Theresa, you also saw the presentation just from Caro. And before getting a bit deeper into discussion, it would be interesting also to hear from you your feedback on the tracker, on our narrative, and also do you have any suggestions how we could eventually improve it? I would say, Theresa, maybe you can start off. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak on this panel. This is a project that I'm personally really excited about, not the least because I've been working on non-fossil fertilizer production for about a year, and Talos, which you mentioned just a minute ago, is a project that I came across by chance pretty much because we went to Nairobi in May for the African Union Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit. And up to that point, we had been thinking about non-fossil fertilizer production in Africa, but only looking at sort of very large scale production. I think the reasoning behind that being that Haber-Bosch becomes a lot more efficient at large scale. And Talos really opened our eyes to what's possible in terms of very small scale production, off-grid and decentralized. And that opens up an entirely new business case because Talos sort of operates from a field, from Kenya Nut Company, and offtake is organized decentralized because Talos produces just for Kenya Nut Company. And at the Federal Foreign Office, I work in the humanitarian sphere, and the kind of production that Talos facilitates for at a small scale has much more or has a lot of potential for food security on the African continent, because you can sell ammonia at a price competitive with import of urea, say from China or from Russia, because transport from Mombasa port to Naivasha, where Talos operates, is so expensive that there is virtually no green premium. And I think without traveling to Nairobi anyway, this is not something I would have easily come across. I think we were looking at the sort of usual suspects, so OCP, Yara, Fertiberia, but it's really great to have this tracker and get beyond the usual suspects and see what's possible. And that's what's really useful about Agora's tracker, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Theresa. Marc, you want to give some feedback as well?
Oh, for sure. I think if you're looking at the tracker, it's not surprising, let's say, the number of companies, especially on the larger scale, and especially if you look at that into the, let's say, the global challenge that there still is. If you look at total production of ammonia in the world, roughly 240 million tons, and there's a tiny fraction that is done in a green way, although there's actually no reason why it should not be green. Now, you've also indicated the issues. A large amount of fertilizer production is unfortunately in the form of urea, which comes quite naturally after an SMR process, but is in a green form is totally very difficult to do. So, and it's not so easy to transform those industries into another industry. Luckily, in Europe, we are basically in the fertilizer sector mostly based on nitrates, and nitrates you can produce without CO2 from the process. So that's a positive thing, which should, in the end, make it much more easy in Europe to do the transition than in, let's say, all the other continents, which are basically urea based. So that's an advantage actually for that Europe has. Then of course the big story about the green premium and who's going to pay for the green premium, that is a puzzle that we are all still working on, and we do that luckily together with a number of the companies that are on your list on the sheet, which does really help. Also the fact that we are running our electrolyzers now for more than 2 years does also help in having the start, making the beginning with the certification, having everything, but you have to do everything from the scratch, and that's also quite a challenge. So still a lot of work needs to be done before it's done, and looking forward to see what would be the next steps. We have a lot of projects in our sleeve working on that, but it's not easy, let's say, to do the main transition and to come to this 6 million tons that you predict. There's a long way to go.
Before going back to Theresa, Marc, can you say something about your own project in Fertiberia, where you are now? Because, I mean, it was on the map, but we didn't elaborate it.
As I said, in Puerto Llano, that's in the middle of Spain, just 2 hours south of Madrid. There we have the electrolyzer running for 2 years now. It's a 20 megawatt electrolyzer. It's running purely on solar, which is directly connected. It's the electrolyzer built by Iberdrola. It's one of the most photographed industrial sites at this moment. You see it everywhere. Every hydrogen conference, you see at least 1 or 2 pictures of this site. It's also the most visited site in the world. I think we had many kings and presidents and whatever. Everybody wants to see where hydrogen is made. So that's interesting. It's still a pity that it's one of the only sites that is actually running. So it's and that is nice. It is a site that links to your schedule as number 4. So we do take all the hydrogen that comes out of the electrolyzer, 100%, and will go directly, will be fed in our Doorn section of a gray ammonia plant. So a part of the production is green. We sell it as green ammonia, and then it's used to produce green fertilizers. But the other part is gray. So it is a what we call a hybrid plant, which is a very elegant way to start, but it's not the end game.
We can later talk a bit about the further process and the challenges and also opportunities. But I first wanted to ask to Theresa. So we've heard also about your engagement in Africa, and you talked a bit about this project in Kenya. In terms of like I heard that you also mentioned with this smaller project, we see lots of opportunities. That would be good if you could elaborate a bit on it, but then also a bit on what are the challenges you see ahead of you for the continent in Africa, and then really in terms of green fertilizers.
Thank you very much, Veerle. Could I come back to your earlier questions? You asked what's really good about this project, and then also what kind of feedback would we have?
Yep.
And if this were like my personal wish list, I think the data that you're providing at the moment is great. However, ideally, we would also have further questions, and I realize that some of these might not be answered by the private sector actors who you're referring to for this project. But in an ideal world, it would also be really interesting to find out who's the off-taker for the ammonia being produced, what further processing is being done. So Marc just spoke about granulation into urea being really expensive, but in what form is the ammonia currently being provided for off-takers? So Talos, for instance, provides ammonia in the form of anhydrous ammonia. And what we're talking about with non-fossil fertilizer production is mainly sort of the defossilizing potential. But if we're then providing anhydrous ammonia, that is usually provided as liquid ammonia, that has to be injected very deeply into the soil in order to not evaporate into the atmosphere. So I think when we're looking, Carol already mentioned earlier, when we're looking at defossilizing ammonia fertilizer, we have to look beyond production. And the more information we can get on who's using that ammonia fertilizer and in what form, the more we can actually assess the degree to which the entire defossilizing potential is being realized in this project. So that would be another interesting piece of information. And then I think you're already looking at, is this off-grid? What kind of renewable energy is being used? And something else that might be interesting is how large is the site? Because on the African continent in particular, land rights and who was land acquired by are also important topics. And water supply, you mentioned, it might be really interesting to find out where does the water come from? Is it from private drilling? Are there any additional measures being undertaken in order to ensure that water scarcity is being addressed in regions where hydrogen is produced? So there are lots of other information points that might be interesting that might not all be available on public websites, but that might, in some cases, they might be available and they would be really useful to integrate in your tool.
Thank you.
And then,
very interesting. Yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
that very much veered away from your question. Would you like to go to Marc next, and then I'll come back with your
No, you can continue,
question.
and then I will ask the same question to Marc, so Marc can think already a bit about the opportunities and challenges. Go ahead, Theresa.
So I think opportunities, the one huge opportunity that you mentioned is defossilization of an energy-intensive sector of the chemical industry. However, at the Federal Foreign Office, fertilizer came up as an issue following the Russian war of aggression. And with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we realized that there were impacts on the global south that we had not foreseen before. And those were, on the one hand, rise in food prices on the world markets, because Ukraine is the grain basket of the world, which we've all heard a lot of times now. But fertilizer prices also rose. And that's partly due to the fact that 80% of nitrogen fertilizer production costs are costs of natural gas. And Russia is an important exporter of natural gas. And the Russian war of aggression drove natural gas prices to unprecedented highs. So we we started thinking about fertilizer supply chains as supply chains that can be instrumentalized from a geopolitical point of view. And decentralized domestic production of fertilizer on the African continent, for instance, also has huge potential to diversify global fertilizer supply chains. And considering the fact that fertilizer is an important ingredient in crop productivity, and hunger, security, climate are all interrelated very directly, there's a lot of geopolitical potential also in promoting domestic fertilizer production. And then on the African continent in particular, soils tend to be more prone to degradation. There's a lot lower fertilizer application rate than, for instance, in Europe, the US, China. And increasing fertilizer production alongside with integrated soil fertility management has the potential to increase crop productivity and thereby promote food security in the long term. So I think beyond fertilization, we're also looking at the geopolitical potential of supply chains and food security in countries with a lot of potential for renewable energy generation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Theresa. Marc, I mean, you mentioned already, or you touched already a bit on certain challenges, but like, what do you see as opportunities for the sector? It's definitely something that I would like to hear from you as well. And then challenges, we will definitely also later on dig a bit further into policies and green premiums. So if you want to mention other challenges, I would say go ahead. Marc, the floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, let's go look into opportunities. The major opportunity would be to stimulate the use of green fertilizers, and you can do that in several ways. And that's basically, I think, one of the few things that could actually work, because it's if you would stimulate it on a European level, for instance, then it makes a lot more sense to also scale up this production. And so that is really a big point. What we also see is that there is an opportunity not only to reduce the fossil-based production, but there are also many opportunities to reduce the Scope 3 emissions of fertilizers. And that is something that needs to be done by fertilizer manufacturers. So that is we're working on that very strongly, and in the programs that we have together with, let's say, the major food producers, we do look at both systems. Yeah, so not only Scope 1, but also Scope 3, because Scope 3 is sometimes even bigger.
Yeah.
And if you do that, actually the use of green fertilizers with Scope 3 emission reduction is a lot more sustainable than the use of manure. Mm-hmm. So it's so what people think is that if you use bio feedstocks or biofertilizers, you're doing something good for the environment. No, actually, if you would use, let's say, the products that are made in this way, you're actually a lot better and more precise. You can have a better crop yield too, and create a solution there. So there is a lot to say, basically, to support these developments in Europe, and making it happen so that it also creates more or less kind of a blending ratio, like with sustainable air fuels, something like that, or approval of using green fertilizers in some areas or in some forms of let's say sustainable farming. So that would help a lot, actually. Mm-hmm. The challenges that we have is, of course, we can do this production as we do in Puerto Llano, but there is a limit to what you can do without changing the whole plant. So basically, as you said, you can do up to 10-20% of the total production you can do green, and the rest is gray. So there is a step function going from 10-20% to 100%, and then it's 100% green. And that's quite a big step actually. So so the investments to do that are also huge. So it's you have to invest a lot in electrolyzers. You have to invest a lot, not only in electrolyzers but also in renewable energy production to make this happen. We do have projects that go all the way together with partners. We don't do that by ourselves, but this is really a major step, and this will take a while. And the projects that we have, they all have kind of a focus to be ready before the end of this decade. But still, those are major multi-billion projects. So it's not something you do lightly, and for that you need to be certain that you can actually sell the product in the end before you take this investment decision. And that is a little bit the dilemma why not a lot more of these really big projects are coming on stream, because yes, it is a lot of fertilizer that then you suddenly have to sell to the companies, and who is going to, where is this market, and who is going to pay the difference in cost.
If we move a bit now to the topic of policies, etc. I mean, what you just mentioned, Marc, the demand, who will pay for the green premium? We have now at EU level a number of policies. How would you evaluate that? I mean, where do you see like, okay, this is putting the sector or the issue in the right direction, and what is still missing? Where would we need extra policy support or other tools to make sure that these dilemmas are being solved?
Yeah, as you just mentioned, 33% of all hydrogen production is going into ammonia, of which 10% goes into chemicals and 22% goes into fertilizer. So there is a big need to actually support this transition. And what we see today is, because Theresa already mentioned it, is that yes, this Russian invasion, Russian aggression, we do see a lot of policies in reducing gas from Russia. But what also happened is by the raising fertilizer prices, the EU has reduced the import duties on fertilizers. And what we see now is 3 to 4 times more imports from Russia of Russian fertilizer. Now, if you compare, let's say, the production of Russian fertilizer with European production, even without any green fertilizers, green hydrogen used, already the Russian production is already 2 to 3 times more emitting than European production. Needless to say that we're basically subsidizing the use of Russian gas this way. So this is something that is definitely needs to stop, because what it does create a very uneconomical situation for fertilizer production at this way, and the fertilizer industry needs to invest a lot to go green. So there is a problem at this moment, and to make this happen. So that is one of the things. The other thing is that so that's a major thing. The other thing is that yes, there is CBAM, which is a good mechanism to let's say to have at least a level playing field between imports and local production. CBAM is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, where if you import a Russian fertilizer, they have to pay for the CO2 emissions that they've done based on the European cost. So this is a good thing. It does help for fertilizer. It does help for ammonia. It will not help for grain. So what it will do, it will increase the cost of fertilizer or ammonia in Europe, because it's difficult to import cheaply. But on the other hand, it does, and it will raise costs for farmers. But then the farmers are stuck in the middle, just as we are now stuck in the middle by grain imports. Because those grain imports, they don't have a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So if you go down the chain, this is getting more and more difficult actually to get it going. And yeah, if you want to have, let's say, so this carbon border, it helps make grain production more expensive. Therefore, green production could become more, or the premium is less.
Yeah.
But we still need to sell it to farmers that will make grain, and they need to compete in their market too. So there is still quite some work to be done.
Theresa, back to you. I mean, I wanted to ask a bit similar question, like what kind of policies or policy tools would you see as being needed to support the developments on the African continent, also for like decentralized smaller projects. Very curious also to hear what your take on this is.
Thank you very much. I think to start with, I would just like to highlight that Marc and myself, we're looking at different markets. And from a German government point of view, we're definitely not looking to stimulate a nitrogen fertilizer demand in the EU. In the EU, as in the US, China, India, Canada, we're already using plenty of nitrogen fertilizer. And we actually have to scale that down. And ideally, we would replace the fossil-based nitrogen fertilizer we're currently using by green fertilizer. But we're not looking to increase that demand. And even globally speaking, we're green ministry, and there are certain planetary boundaries within which we're acting. And looking at a planetary boundary on nitrogen, we're already past that. So I think we have to shift usage of nitrogen fertilizer and make sure that countries, especially on the African continent, get more accessible, affordable, available nitrogen fertilizer in order to prevent further soil degradation. But we need to use less in Germany and in, I think, all of the European countries. So I think that there's a slight difference in perspective between the two of us. And then also, Marc spoke about substituting mineral fertilizer for organic fertilizer for manure. But from our perspective, sustainability doesn't end with driving emissions down as low as possible, but we're also looking at economical and social sustainability. And farmers on the African continent won't be able to buy all the fertilizer they need in order to manage soil health from Chinese urea, when manure is cheaper to produce and can be used locally. We're looking at promoting access to mineral fertilizer, and particularly non-fossil nitrogen fertilizer on the African continent, looking at the entire value chain from non-fossil production all the way to making that available to smallholder farmers. And I think one of the challenges that we're currently looking at is how to organize offtake for non-fossil fertilizer on the African continent. And the small-scale project by Talus is quite charming in that way, because they have one off-taker, and that's one large conventional farmer, Kenya Nut Company, and they have a 10-year off-take agreement that makes the investment by Talus viable, because they have only 3 containers and fairly low capital costs to begin with. And what we're looking at from a German government perspective is how to support cooperative offtake by smallholder farmers, that not only do large-scale conventional farmers get access to non-fossil nitrogen fertilizer in the way Kenya Nut Company does, but have a collective offtake by several smallholder farmers who are engaged not only in producing food for export, like macadamia nuts by Kenya Nut Company, but food for local use. So they contribute to feeding Kenya. And from our perspective, that's essential to harnessing the holistic potential of decentralized non-fossil fertilizer production.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We are moving to the end of our panel discussion. I have one question still for both of you, and Marc, if you still want to react, or Theresa as well, on each other's response, go ahead. Huh? Also in this last question I ask you, so it's a bit, how do you see the future of the renewable fertilizer industry? And what are, I mean, you partially already mentioned it, Marc, but what are your next steps to support this? I mean, and I can ask that to both of you from your own perspective, like what will be from a company perspective, or then from the government perspective in Africa. What are your next steps to support the future and the further development of the renewable fertilizer industry? Marc, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, what we're doing is, of course, to work together with the major food companies in Europe to grow this market. They have set also targets for themselves. There are many other companies also who set targets for themselves, and they cannot do everything with they need mineral fertilizers to do this job. And what we see is that there are a number of applications where, let's say, the fertilizer use does play an important role in the total CO2 footprint of the product, but it does not play a major role in the or a much less role in the cost of the production of that product. So there is a balance to be found, and of course we focus on those product areas that have especially this leverage. So they're where, let's say, CO2 footprint is very high because of the fertilizer use, but the fertilizer cost is not the main determining factor in the end product. So there are some markets there that are reasonably big and that could sustain, let's say, the production that we have, and we wish to grow, let's say, our production in line with those demands. So there we have projects, long-term escalations, where we can grow together with those companies. We're looking for more companies to do this, but to do, let's say, the full transition, you either need to have green fertilizer being cheaper than gray. So that can be done by penalizing the gray fertilizer market by putting taxes and everything. But then you have to, but that will be very detrimental for the farmers. Farmers are driving to Brussels every week these days, so that is not most likely not going to happen. So that higher cost of fertilizer is also giving higher cost of food, and we all need to eat. And there is a growing perception, luckily within Europe, that fertilizer is an essential need to be able to have autonomy in Europe. We cannot be dependent for our fertilizer consumption of Mr. Putin, especially for our food production. So it's not only gas, but it's also food that is at stake here. So there is that's definitely a big thing, but for that we need to move in the right direction, create this market, and people are thinking about creating how to create this market. But of course, today I voted for the European Parliament in Europe. Not a lot is happening at this moment because they're waiting for this new parliament and see what happens and see which new policies will be voted in this system. But a lot of things needs to come from Europe. The good news is there's a growing interest in fertilizers. The bad news is we still need a lot of these programs. And to give you an idea, if the project is not running at this moment, or you're not engineering a project at this moment, it's impossible to have it happen before 2030 at this moment. These projects take a long time.
Yeah.
You have to build the renewable energy, you have to build the power connection, which is a big thing. You have to potentially build the pipeline to transport the hydrogen, and then you have to build an ammonia plant. And if you're lucky, there is already a fertilizer plant in the site. Otherwise, you have to build that too. And those projects take a lot of time and a lot of money, and therefore need a lot of certainty to be successful.
Yeah. Theresa, you also want to give your last view on future of the renewable fertilizer industry?
Thank you. I think again I'll try to look at the African continent. I think with lots of countries with huge potential for renewable energy generation, like Kenya, Ethiopia, Mauritania, Morocco, Namibia, what's currently holding these projects, holding a lot of renewable projects back, is cost of capital and offtake. And in Kenya, for instance, the rate of rural electrification is very high, but most households that are electrified only use the equivalent of 1 light bulb per day. And green hydrogen production has the potential to use that excess energy. And if we turn it into fertilizer, that's something that then can be used in the agricultural sector, which is a very important sector in most of these countries. So I think there's huge potential in that. But the issue of cost of capital in developing countries still has to be addressed, and small scale projects like Talos can be one answer to that question. Another can be large scale projects realized by Yara or Fortescue, but these are then also looking to establish projects on the African continent and export, for instance, to Australia later on. And I think what we're trying to do as a Foreign Office at the moment is stay in very close contact with our partners in order to enable them to create the kind of environment where the potential of green hydrogen production comes with local benefits. So local benefits in terms of value creation on the African continent, benefits for the agricultural sector, hopefully some job creation and some contribution towards food security and long-term soil health management.
Thank you. And with this, we come to an end of our panel exchange. So we will soon move to our questions and answers from or questions from the audience. We see that questions are coming in, but if you still have a question, put it in the question and answer Zoom function. Before we go to the questions, we still have a Mentimeter question for you. So please go to menti.com. You see the link also in the chat. And the question is, which countries will be key production centers of renewable fertilizers in the next few years? And so you see the link in the chat and also the correct code 35140309. Which countries will be key production centers of renewable fertilizers in the next years? And so the answers are coming in. I'll still give you a bit of time. Yeah, see, spread, yeah, again, see some Northern European, but also then Southern. So Brazil is mentioned, Namibia, which is of course now, and Chile, a lot in the news, Australia, so India, US to a smaller extent, but so that quite a lot of these countries are also now very often in the news when we talk about hydrogen projects. Good. Thank you all for your responses. So, and then we move to the questions from the audience. We will welcome also 2 additional persons to the panel. I would like to ask my colleague Caro to join the panel. And then I would also like to invite Matthias Deutsch. He's heading the hydrogen team in Agora Industry, and they will also join in our last session in this webinar. I will ask the question, and then I will hand it to somebody. But of course, if the other panelists also want to contribute to the question, just give a small signal, and then we can also hand it over to you. But so first question is a question to Marc on CBAM. Marc, you mentioned it already, and you noted that the current carbon pricing policy is not enough to incentivize renewable fertilizers over conventional ones. Do you see CBAM measures impacting this directly?
It will help. It will help, but it will not cover the whole the difference. So it's yeah, that's if you make the calculations right now, if you look at let's say gas cost of making the fertilizer and the CO2 cost, it definitely creates a smaller gap, but the gap is not gone. The other thing is that if you look at green fertilizers, the economics of making green fertilizers is completely different from that of the commodity markets like gray fertilizer. So what you see is the gray fertilizers, they go up and down, they move with the gas price, they move with the ammonia cost, which are commodities. They are traded, they do go up and down. And we've seen during the Russian invasion, for instance, with the extremely high gas prices, that it was cheaper to make green fertilizers than gray at a certain point. But those things rarely happen again. So it's what we see now is that with lower gas prices, yeah, the gap is bigger again. So that is, so gray is moving up and down. What you see green is basically the investment. You need to invest in the renewables, you need to invest in the electrolyzer, you need to invest in the ammonia plant or the fertilizer. Yep. Once you've done all the investments, the variable cost is practically zero. It's only water that you need to put in, and water, although in some areas it's scarce, is not very expensive. So it's a fixed price, more or less. It's not a commodity that is traded. So there you fix everything. So basically you can sell the product at a fixed price for 20 years and ahead, and then the banks are very happy. So there is a difference between traditional market, which goes up and down on a lower level, and then you have the green fertilizer that is more or less flat at a high level, and sometimes in very rare cases, yeah, this gray goes above that level. So that is basically the discussion we're also having with our customers. Yeah, somehow they need to accept that it has a kind of a fixed price mechanism, which is something that is that is there.
Yeah. A question then for Theresa. Can renewable ammonia plants be operated cost effectively at small scale? And I think it's from your perspective, of course, from the African continent.
That's something we were unsure about in the early stages as well. I think Talos has proven that to some extent. The main thing to take in consideration of when looking at the African continent is the cost of transportation. So at the moment, most of the nitrogen fertilizer used in East Africa is imported from China. That's urea. And that's imported into Mombasa port, for instance, in Kenya. And what Talos did is they moved their production site 6 hours drive, or maybe 10 hours drive away from Mombasa, land inwards. And that distance from Mombasa to Naivasha, where Talos production site is located, is so expensive to cover that the price of non-fossil fertilizer is produced locally is actually lower than the price of urea imported. And then the second thing to think about is access to foreign currency. So countries like Kenya, but also Ethiopia, import all their mineral and synthetic fertilizers from abroad, but they're not. At the moment, the US dollar is quite strong, particularly in relation to the Ethiopian currency, and in order the world market price of nitrogen fertilizer is not the same at all as price of fertilizer in Ethiopia once you figure in the cost of hard currency and then tariffs and transport and all of that. So that makes that diminishes the green premium quite significantly.
Thank you, Theresa. Marc, another question for you. Off-takers of the green ammonia, is the whole production utilized to produce green fertilizers, or does it also serve other uses?
Yeah, we have the majority goes into green fertilizers. I must say. We do also have some other uses like green explosives or green other products. Due to the difference in cost, we don't sell it as green ammonia at this moment. That is not really workable. But as green fertilizers, yes, and that is, and we have, let's say, limited, because we only have a limited amount of product. So we do limit the sales of those green fertilizers to our Impact Zero product line, where it is a combination of, let's say, the Scope 1 emission reduction, so the green fertilization, the N2O emission reduction on the nitric acid part, which is also very important, which is, for instance, absent in Russia and is more than the CO2 emissions of an ammonia production. And then the Scope 3 emissions on the field, where we can, by putting additives and putting some microbial mechanisms to reduce those Scope 3 emissions, which is super important to have, let's say, the total maximum emission reduction available.
And Marc, then we have, of course, also a question on the European Hydrogen Bank auction. Spanish and German green hydrogen projects had a great share of winning projects in the pilot auction from the European Hydrogen Bank. Can this support the green fertilizer production? Or are these fiscal incentives targeting rather the mobility sector?
Now, what we see is that, yes, it does. We are also connected to one of those projects that have won. So we're happy with that. The thing is that it doesn't bridge the gap, right? It doesn't bridge the gap, and it will not, the amount of money. But that is also not the most important question. The most important question is, does it bridge the gap of green ammonia produced elsewhere? And can we, by doing this, can we produce green ammonia in a competitive way in Spain compared to areas that have, let's say, maybe even better conditions, or even better financial conditions, or even better labor conditions than in Spain? And that is something that was the main purpose of looking into this comparison. Now, the levels of support, they definitely don't correct the difference between gray and green production, but it does help a lot in creating an affordable green ammonia production. Yes. And competitive green ammonia production, and that's what we're looking at.
Yeah. Then there is a question also for Matthias. It says, I found it very interesting that the concept of renewable fertilizer was used. Why do you prefer this concept of label to those of low carbon or green fertilizer?
Thank you. So the way we see our tracker, it's supposed to be a contribution to the discussion on net zero compatible fertilizer production. And when you open long-term energy system scenarios, I think most analysts agree that renewable fertilizer will be the only solution in the long run, even though they may not agree what exactly the long run is. But if you see, for example, in our tracker, that's something Caro also showed, for 2030, we have taken the IEA net zero emissions scenario. And for 2030, we see something around 6 megatons that will be needed. IEA says electricity based. We would interpret that as renewable electricity and renewable hydrogen based. And we do acknowledge that the discussion is obviously broader. There is a discussion on low carbon hydrogen applications, especially for the short to medium term. But for now, this is out of scope of this particular tracker project. However, I would just stress that we are definitely eager to learn how and in which time frame companies that are starting with low carbon today, low carbon fertilizer, how they want to go further reduce GHG emissions to get to this transition of renewable fertilizer in a later stage. Because this is also what Marc related to when he said, well, that's about a lot of investment. It's about especially investment in additional renewable energy sources. And this is the big thing we are interested in the long run, and we want to track that, and we want to make a contribution to that discussion.
Thank you, Matthias. I see the time is moving fast.
Can I respond to
yes,
that?
Yes, go ahead, Marc.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we do see that there's definitely a market for low carbon, for instance, ammonia or low carbon hydrogen in the world. What we have more difficulty to see is that, let's say, in the food market, let's put it this way, we do see a strong tendency to only accept green. And that is because of the fact that food companies, they don't want to be exposed to having to explain, this is, let's say, low carbon ammonia, and it is produced this way, and it is with so much % of CO2 emission reduction and blah, blah, blah. So that is what they just want to have, let's say, what they say, the real thing, green ammonia made from sun or wind or water power, and not something else. So there is a big trend. There is a push actually for green in that sector. Where low carbon does work is, of course, to lower the overall emissions of the different producers. It doesn't help at all to meet another difficult word, the RFNBO targets that are set by Europe. It makes it even more difficult to meet those targets if you would go into the low carbon area. But that's a completely different discussion. But it is a big thing. It's a big thing that's not helping us. And it will have an application in, for instance, the maritime sector. And we do see that green, blue, low carbon ammonia will play a role in decarbonizing the maritime sector. So using it as a fuel to transport ships all over the world, their ammonia and, for instance, also methanol will have a definite role, where ammonia has the advantage that it doesn't contain carbon, where methanol does. So it's there is a distinct role for low carbon ammonia in that area, I think, but less in the fertilizer as we expected.
Yeah, and then one last question, maybe a bit issues that we have been already dealt with, but still, how far are you from obtaining a sustainable fertilizer at a competitive price, given that producing green hydrogen is even more expensive than gray? And then also, is there any transition strategy from gray to green? Demobilize gas plants to switch to electrolyzers? It's a long question, but it's also to Marc. Yeah.
Yeah, I assumed it was for me. Anyway, yeah, we have that. We also do see that with the full CBAM policy in place, but that's 2033 basically. Then the difference between green and gray production is reduced. What we would also see then in that area is that blue ammonia, so low carbon ammonia, could be cheaper than gray actually. So because the cost of carbon storage is less than the ETS cost at that moment, and you can do that everywhere. So there could be that blue could be cheaper than gray at that moment. So there is another gap that you need to look at. But green versus gray is yes, that gap is a lot less. And if you then start producing from that same ammonia, starting to produce fertilizer, you kind of dilute that green premium quite a lot. So then it becomes much more affordable, and it will not at that moment most likely will not place such a detrimental role on the increase of food prices at that moment. It will hardly be seen actually in the price of most of the large commodities or the bigger products. So it becomes affordable at that moment. That's our expectation, and there are two reasons for that. Gray becomes more expensive, but also we hope that we don't see it at this moment, but we do hope that at a certain point electrolyzers are also becoming more affordable, and renewable energy also becomes more affordable. So that is something we already see now, especially in the Netherlands, most likely also in Germany, that in the summer there are quite a lot of periods with negative power prices. So there is, and then renewable energy is affordable. So that is we see that more and more, which will definitely also help in making green hydrogen production also more competitive.
Thank you, Marc, for your response to this last question, because we are almost at 3:30. I would like to ask my colleague Matthias if he wants to still give like a last small summary and outlook. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. So first of all, a big thank you to all the contributors to this event today. So I'm talking about Theresa, Marc, Veerle, Caro, and all the other colleagues, Emir, who have contributed to this, and some of them are not even showing face here today. Thank you very much. Let me say three short things in the end. First, again, cautioning a bit about the limited scope of what we are doing here with this tracker. Our tracker looks at the greenhouse gas emissions reduction from nitrogen fertilizer production. And I stress production. So all the other greenhouse gas emissions and environmental challenges that come especially with over-fertilization in the world, we can't cover this here in greater depth. I think that's always important to keep in mind. And the second thing is this tracker launch today really is, from our perspective, is a kickoff to go more deeply into the topic. And we want to look at the transformation opportunities and constraints, at willingness to pay and off-takers. And in the end, also ask like what policies are needed to really make this happen, the transformation. And final point, stay tuned for more to come from Agora. We have an upcoming industry conference next Tuesday in Brussels, and you can still register for that, I think, be it in person or online. Then second thing, we also care about cost. This current fertilizer tracker doesn't tell you a whole lot about cost, but we do have a tool, cost tool for many different molecules for download for free on our website. This will be, by the way, updated soon before the summer with a more interactive version, optimized cost calculations. So nice stuff coming up. For the EU in particular, in some weeks you can actually find a whole map of LCOH estimates across Europe with high granularity, where we compare a bit LCOE, so kind of cost of electrons versus cost of molecules. And finally, you can be, I think, looking forward to a publication that is a bit kind of like we're scrutinizing the idea of the European hydrogen backbone. How will hydrogen imports come, in particular to Germany, via pipeline? How realistic is that? How feasible is it for the early 2030s? Which is, I would say, like tomorrow when you talk about investment, and Marc cautioned us that that is in fact very, very soon.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And that's, and you can always register for our Agora newsletter, of course.
Thank you, Matthias. I would like to thank all participants for joining and helping us also to shape this webinar today by coming up with very good questions. I would also like to thank all the panelists, Theresa and Marc, for your contributions. It was a very interesting discussion from both of your perspectives. Thank you to all colleagues for your contributions and your help for making this webinar a success today.